Hello, everyone. My name is Nahed Mansour, and I'm the Senior Manager of Programs at the Gardner Museum. Thank you for joining us today, and welcome to our Three Works program featuring Samir Farooq in conversation with Sequoia Miller, the Gardner Museum's Chief Curator. You will notice your mics and videos are muted, and the chat option has been disabled. However, there will be a Q&A following their conversation, and so we invite you to send us questions through the Q&A function at any point. And please note that this program is being recorded and live streamed through Facebook Live. So before I hand it over to Sequoia, I would like to acknowledge that Toronto is located on treaty lands and ancestral territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Petun, and the Mississaugas of the Credit Nation. The community we work in is the home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to learn and live on this land. The Gardner Museum also acknowledges the current cultural reckoning with racism, colonialism, and systemic inequality. Like most cultural institutions, we are looking critically at our own practices. While this process affects all areas of the museum, our permanent collection embodies great potential for new questions and approaches. We are committed to a process of reconsidering the museum's collection. In that spirit, I'm eager to listen to the conversation Sequoia will have with today's presenter, Samir Farooq, as Samir has been exploring these themes through the idea of fragments, urging museums to think about the gaps in their institutional narratives. I'll now turn off my video and mic and correspond with you over the chat box. Okay, I'll hand it over to Sequoia now.
Great, thank you, Nahed. Nahed will still, of course, be here, but we just won't be seeing her. So, hello, greetings. Welcome to everyone who's joining us today. So glad that you could be here to hear and participate in a conversation with Samir Farooq. And hello, Samir. Welcome to the Gardner.
Hi, thank you.
I'll start off first by introducing Samir, so all the folks listening have a sense of who you are, Samir. So, Samir is a Canadian artist of Pakistani and Ugandan Indian descent. His interdisciplinary practice investigates tactics of representation and enlists the tools of sculpture, installation, photography, documentary filmmaking, writing, and the methods of anthropology to explore various forms of collecting, interpreting, and display. The result of these projects is often a collaborative work which counterbalances how dominant institutions speak about our lives. A counter archive, new additions to a museum collection, or a buried history made visible. Farooq has held numerous exhibitions at institutions across Canada, including the Aga Khan, the Art Gallery of Ontario, Contemporary Art Gallery in Vancouver, as well as internationally in the United States, the UK, France, Egypt, Turkey, and elsewhere. Writing on Samir's work has appeared widely in a number of publications, both print and digital, and Samir was longlisted for Canada's Sobey Award in 2018. I am super happy to be able to have this opportunity to speak with Samir. So again, welcome, delighted that you're here and delighted we can chat today.
Thank you.
So the theme of our day is fragments. I think I'll share my screen again so that we can start looking at some of your images. But maybe one place to start would be for just to start thinking about that word fragments. What are some of the ways that you think of fragments? What are some of the meanings?
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me and allowing me to kind of meditate on this word fragments. And I think when we think about museums in particular and the way that they're built and the way that history is constructed, if we think about these processes that historians, that museologists, that conservators use to piece together like a coherent history, we often think about fragments. And within these fragments, there's a lot of discovery and a lot of curiosity, but also there are a lot of mistakes made and there are a lot of gaps between the fragments. There are a lot of assumptions. And so I've located my work a lot within these gaps. And I think there's a lot of richness there to try to understand what gets lost from the capture when we try to capture history and when we try to let it unfold in institutions such as museums. So that's what I think when I think about fragments. There's a beautiful quote by the ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus, who said, the fairest order of the world is a random pile of sweepings. So I think, like, within the context of the museum and within all of its rigid taxonomies, so much of the work that I do is based upon this idea of adjacencies, of fragments, piles, and that perhaps that is actually the fairest way to let the world unfold.
Wow. Yeah, right. That's fantastic. I love that idea of kind of sweepings and piles as being the way that kind of meaning comes together and is generated. It makes me think of course, Robert Morris, the conceptual artist who had, piles of sweepings on the floor, but also this idea of meaning coming through adjacencies rather than through hierarchies, right? So difference would be the semiotic word for it. Like how do objects or images or people, for that matter, sort of gain and change meanings based on the gaps, actually, of being fragments. So with this in mind, maybe we could start looking at Terma and the image that we have on the screen here. Can you describe the project a little bit for folks who are not familiar?
Yeah, so this is a project that I did in collaboration with Jared Stanley, who is an incredible Bay Area poet who's based in Reno, Nevada. And this exhibition was at the Lilly Museum, which is in Reno at the University of Nevada at Reno. So it's their new exhibition space, and we were their inaugural exhibition. So what we wanted to do, we challenged ourselves to try to come up with a museum based on internal excavation. So, like, so much of museum practice has been, for centuries, collecting with the eyes open. And what we wanted to propose is building a museum through collecting with the eyes closed. So what this allowed us to do was to welcome the potential of the imagination and of sort of somatic inquiry to enter into museum space. So what we have here, like in the front, we're a series called 24 Affections. And what they are these sort of large suspended monoprints based on meditation. So basically, I wanted this sort of lyric museum to be a conversation between an artist, myself, and a poet. So basically, I would send Jared these images or descriptions of these images, and then on the reverse side, he would write about them in these expanded labels. So basically, the museum became almost like this collaborative, this result of a collaboration of the excavation of our own internal processes and our visions and our internal vision. And so the work consisted of 5 sort of major new works, and they were all based upon this process, this sort of dialogue of discussing what we were seeing internally with each other.
That's so cool. I have a bunch of kind of thoughts and questions, and one of them has to do with language and text and words, and sort of the role of language in this project, which you've hinted at a little bit. One by collaborating with a writer, a poet, and the other by having these kind of expanded labels that you mentioned. And I'm wondering, how do you think about this relationship between text and image or object in your own artistic practice more broadly, or in your own way of understanding the world?
Yeah. Well, in this case, I always wanted to collaborate with Jared, because we share this interest in collecting from the air. So when Jared sits down to write poetry, he's sort of waiting for language to appear. He's pulling words from the environment, from things that he's heard, from different texts he's come across. And then at the same time, when I drop into an exercise, if it's a meditation or a more physical exercise that's geared to sort of pull out images from my own experience, I'm also sort of trying to evoke these images and then pull them into museum space. So we had that in common. And, you know, I think what's fundamental to museums is this dance between language and objects, or language and images. So it just seemed like a very natural union, and quite one that I learned a lot from, because there's also some things that images and objects can't touch that language can really dig deep into. So I really enjoyed that process.
It's so tricky, isn't it? That kind of balance and figuring out when to go deeper into which realm, and then how to kind of stitch them together. I love how you're doing it in this piece. I'm going to advance to the next image now. So this is one of the aspects of this larger Terma project, and maybe this piece would be a good way to think about another question that I have for you, which has to do with this idea of a sort of the museum that comes from within, or that kind of the notion of collecting with your eyes closed is a way of, in a sense, for me, it evokes this image of kind of being present in the world in a sort of outward motion, as opposed to what folks often identify typically as the origin of museums and museum culture, which is the bringing in, the kind of the gathering and the collecting. In Europe, typically of princely collections and aristocratic collections that were often premised on this idea of dominion, of a sort of ownership and status, and the sort of the tension between that idea of a museum as a drawing in impulse versus a museum as an opening and broadening impulse. I don't know if that is a relevant thought for you, and if it is, how it would sort of come, how would it be evident in this work, or would that idea relate to this work at all?
Yeah, at first glance, I don't think a lot of this work looks very formal, doesn't it? Like there are these very beautiful shapes and colors and these gradients. But thank you for bringing up sort of the history of museums, because what I want to outline is that to me, this work is profoundly political, and it's very important in my work to start chipping away at a very nuanced approach to the advent of, or the beginnings of, museums. So in this case, what I did was I took on the challenge of collecting from the inside. So every day for about 2 years, I explored a different modality, like a different internal modality. So it might be a seated meditation, it might be a series of body movements, of choreography, and each time I was almost trying to twist images out of my body, and then also give value to these images as coming from me and coming from a body that, you know, grew up not seeing anything, you know, from my life in museums. And I think that goes for everybody across racial and class, for many people across racial and class lines as well. So this image of this sort of omphalos form, what I call it, where it's like this tip reaching upward and then this larger base. That was actually the first shape that came to me when I started doing these exercises. And then what I wanted to do was try to find a place within the museum for these objects to exist. So over the past 15 years, I've been photographing the display of museums from around the world. And so I have this immense archive of museological displays. And then within my sort of own visions, let's say, I went through the archive and just said, okay, where should this shape land? Where should this shape land? Where should this shape land? And I came upon this stepped sort of pyramidal form from the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. And they had a similar display to this, but of lead weights. And so then I thought, so that was really a guiding principle of like, where would this shape land? So in a way, that's my way of having my objects be in direct dialogue with museological practices and with display practices. Except, you know, instead of showing things that were part of some, you know, unknown collection or gift.
Right.
These
Gift,
are,
yeah.
these are, you know, these are deeply subjective objects. So I think, you know, an interesting question to ask is like, how much room is there for subjectivity of the public, you know, in museum space? How can we invite these everyday, offensive, ugly, deeply meaningful objects, you know, into collections, and how can that begin to, you know, really begin to chip away at the very cohesive, rigid structures that have been, you know, inherited from, you know, centuries of looting turned into, you know, polite museum practice
Right.
and expertise.
Right. Subjectivity of the public is a really interesting phrase to think about in this context. And thank you for posing that question. I don't have a response right now, other than I think I'm going to write it on my wall behind me and think about what are the potential meanings for that, in that, like what are the possibilities in that, because it does seem to be quite broad, both embodying and reflecting those subjectivities. I guess one question that comes to mind from what you were saying is that recalling that your initial training, I understand, was in cultural anthropology, and in wondering if there's a difference for you between anthropological museums and art museums in terms of how they relate to the subjectivities of the public, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, there's a huge difference between, you know, just your approach of like a contemporary art museum versus like an encyclopedic museum, you know, or like a museum that claims to piece together sort of broad historical narratives based on, you know, nationalism or whatever. My interest is the latter. So I think a lot of the patterns are still evident in contemporary art museums. But to me, in my own practice, the richness to locate my work is in these encyclopedic museums. And I think, and so these are like world history museums or ethnographic museums or museums of anthropology, because I think it's very clear to see certain things. And, you know, those things are the fingerprints of the institution on the material. So that's what was collected, what items were put next to each other, what was not included, and how are these objects displayed. So even the profound significance of a display case, you know, taking an object originally from its context, you know, let's say like a Buddha head from the Gandhara region of Pakistan, and putting that in a sealed case, you know, in the British Museum. You know, in terms of my practice, there's a lot of richness to think around what that means. And, you know, we then can really get into discussions about private property, you know, what's happening outside of the museum and how that's very, very much mirrored with other types of museums. Those patterns definitely exist. I think, you know, we see those patterns in like who is chosen, it, you know, in terms of inclusion in contemporary art collections, who's given over the main halls of the museum as opposed to like the window spaces or
the wings, or the balcony. I know it's always like on the mezzanine or something, right?
There was there was
a
a point in my 20s where I was like, when will I leave the window and make it into the main halls? Or so yeah.
I think this idea of both the question of subjectivity as a public and the idea of private possessions is a great entry point into the next work that you brought for us to talk about today, which is a project called Boop Museum. And so we're looking at the installation here, and maybe you could briefly say like what happens to these, what happened and happens to these objects.
Sure. So this was a project I did with the incredible curator, Sandy Saad, who was at the Visual Arts Center in Clarington, which is in Bowmanville. And so when we were touring Bowmanville, we visited the Clarington Museum and Archives, which is another institution. And I was sort of looking through, and the curator there said, you know, we're deaccessioning a huge part of our collection. I understand you work with collections. Do you want the stuff? And I was like, you want to give me your museum? So I said, of course. I brought it back to my studio and I began to unbox everything. And to my horror, it was all dolls. And I learned that this museum was wanting to be Canada's largest doll museum, or, you know, one of the world's largest doll museums. But because the priorities of the museum shifted to actually reflecting Clarington County in their museum, these didn't have a place in the museum anymore. So I became so once I worked past this thing about like, oh God, like I'm gonna be one of these doll artists, you know, which I don't.
Which you have yet to fully embrace. But
I remember my first sculpture class, in the Netherlands, my professor was like, you know, I have a rule, no doll heads, no doll bodies in your sculptures. And suddenly, you know, I have all these boxes of dolls. So I became really interested in like the dregs of the collection. So when museums go through processes of deaccessioning, suddenly objects that were so valued and so precious and so much effort went into collecting them suddenly are not important anymore. They're just, you know, at the bottom of the barrel. You know, they're just what they are. They're just objects, you know.
Right.
So I thought it would be interesting as an artist to position myself in between this process of the museum sort of releasing these objects, and then, you know, between that and the potential of where they would end up. So what I did in this project is I designed the Boop Museum, which is for kids. And so I saw that like the rightful owners of these dolls are for kids. So I built this quite a large space where all of the pedestals, and you'll see like these common elements from my archive of museum displays, like the pyramidal sort of shape. So I built them all for children under 4 feet tall. So it became a shrunken museum geared for the eye level of kids. And so this was shown for about a month. And then on the final day of the exhibition, there was an open call for all the children of the county to loot the museum. And it was incredible. So I really encouraged the kids to plunder the museum, to destroy it, you know, and it was my way of like putting myself in the role of like a curator who like carefully, you know, or a prep person who carefully arranged and named all of the objects, and then just allowing it to go. So it was a real practice in sort of our relationship to objects, the lifeline of objects within museums, and like what happens when they leave museum space. So, you know, within, I don't know, like 3 minutes, everything was just
right, like a flock, like they descended on these objects and kind of picked them and traded them, and
yeah,
and there's
exactly.
sort of this debris field left at the end a little bit.
Yeah, there's a video on the Visual Arts Center of Clarington website that you can see.
Great, and for folks, there is a link that Nahed posted for that. So one thing that I love about this project is this idea of sort of animating deaccessions, basically, so that it's an active and kind of visible process. I think, obviously, the whole premise of a museum collection is that the works are out of the commodity flow, that they have come out of the cycle of commodities, and they've entered this sort of sacred space in some ways. But in fact, there's some elasticity to that, right? That museums routinely and consistently deaccession as priorities and as values kind of recalibrate in a kind of constant way. I remember long ago hearing a benchmark early on for the Museum of Modern Art was when they were collecting contemporary art, that it was maybe 10% that would stay in the collection long term. Because in the moment, work has one particular value, but over time, some work becomes more relevant and other work less relevant. And of course, this entire process from beginning to end and the frame itself is ideological, right? It's ideologically loaded. So this question of like, sort of what it means, I guess of rightful ownership is the other phrase that kind of stood out to me in what you were saying, this notion of what is the ownership of these objects? How does their flow sort of through these kind of Gore-Tex-y borders that are kind of permeable in one direction but not another? Like, how does that allow them to take on certain meanings and not others? Maybe.
Yeah. I like this question, and I would also ask another one, which is like, how do we remove an object? And I think this is so relevant now with so much talks about repatriation of objects back to their original context, these calls by a number of artists, by the softening of that the Black Lives Matter movement has created to beginning to soften and open up to these discussions, which I'm endlessly grateful for the widespread effect that this has had. And I think for me, this question, like, it's a simple one. How do you remove an object? So, but it's very, very loaded. So initially, a lot of objects were removed from places far from where, you know, they're displayed now. And it's almost as though, you know, with every few decades, this question is brought up again of removal. What does the removal of an object from a context, what does it actually do to the place it was removed from? What does it do to the economy that it was removed from? And now when we talk about repatriation of objects, what does it do to remove these objects from museums in the West, in Europe and North America, where a lot of them have been housed? And I think these are very nuanced, profound questions that we need to ask ourselves. There are no quick solutions. Every object has its own story, has its own provenance, and each object has to be dealt with on a case-by-case basis. But yeah, I'm really interested in this question about like the removal within like the 19th century, and now maybe the removal, you know, within the 21st century, and you know what that means.
I'd love to go to the third work that you brought with you today to speak about it for just a minute, and then we'll get to a handful of questions. It's been great to see some questions coming in, and folks who are listening, I'd encourage you to continue to ask some questions. So these works are from a project called Proof Sausage Wait Arc, which was at the Aga Khan Museum a couple of years ago. And so you were just speaking about removal, and in some sense, this project is about absences in a way. Do you feel that these kind of forms and questions speak to this idea of removal?
Yeah, definitely. So what you're seeing is a series of ceramic sculptures that were inspired by the props of conservators. So that's another location in museums that I've really taken an interest to, is the labor and the care that conservators exert in museums. You know, both as the protectors of these objects, but also the protectors of, you know, the difficult histories of museums. So I recreated like the tissue paper proof, the sausage weight, the bag weight, and a few arcs of styrofoam that I saw in the storage space of a conservator at the Aga Khan Museum in Toronto. And so the way that I arranged them in the display cases in the museum, what I wanted to do was encourage the viewer to think about what has been left out of museum collections. So there are indentations where imaginary objects would have pushed against. There are gaps between the poofs, and there are gaps between the bag weights and the sausage weights, to encourage the viewer to almost transpose their imagination into museum space. And I think that's some, you know, I've had a little bit of distance from this project, and I think that's the ultimate aim of the project, is sort of giving the public the freedom to allow their imagination to exist rather than being told what to think and told what to do. I wanted to create a bit of openness, a bit of open space for people to you know, transpose. So it's both, you know, commenting on what's left out of these collections, but it's also this encouragement for the public to think about what's important in their lives, to sort of tell the story of their lives. And, you know, like so much of my work, it is about presencing absence within museum space.
One thing I love about your work, though, is that it is so open in that way, and that you create a sort of an opportunity for presence without defining specifically what that presence is, right? And so, and in a way that speaks to this idea of fragment. It's like the piece that leans against something, or the aspect, I think, more than literal piece, that leans against something to show that that thing is there, but
Yeah.
there's not a definition of what that thing is necessarily. You keep that open as a question, which is great because it makes it still under conversation in a way. It makes it still part of an aspect of contemplation rather than a sort of an end point. It becomes like an ongoing line of thinking.
Yeah. Yeah.
I want to get to a couple of questions because we have about 10 minutes left. So one of the questions that has come in has to do with the arrangement of objects and placing objects next to each other. I think this might be a good image to pursue this question. So I'll just read it out loud. How does your choice of placement create differences in position, shapes, colors, and how do these create questions?
Oh, that's such a beautiful question. You know, when I start working with materials, so a library of color and form sort of emerges. And, you know, as an artist, I just try not to step in the way of that. So when you see that, those omphalos, like on the stepped pyramid from the Terma exhibition, this one, I actually stood back and was quite surprised with the story that it formed just formally alone, you know? So so that was a real surprise to me. And a lot of it is about like what's available and, you know, what I have access to, which also tells a story about like what makes it into my own speculative museums. And then in terms of arrangement, the containers and the adjacencies in museums are everything. So the spaces between the objects, the display cases, the shelves, the ways that vitrines are oriented in, like, let's say a long row through a hallway, or in a sort of maze-like structure to go around. All of those moves, that's what shows the fingerprints of the institution. So, what we can see now in terms politically, what's going on, that's like one layer, really questioning leadership, questioning boards. But my practice is interested in digging in another way, which is about what are these invisible moves that are happening specifically in display and arrangement that talk about the people behind the ideology. So thanks for that question. I think it's a huge part of my practice.
Great answer too. Another question that we've come in has to do with the question of agency and the agency of the fragment versus the agency of the whole, and thinking about how those two relate to each other, I guess. Do you feel that there's less agency in an object that is whole rather than in one that is a fragment?
Oh my goodness. Yeah, I can only speak in terms of my own practice. And I'll say this, every time I go to a museum, I gravitate toward like a broken tablet or a broken vase, or like, there's always this like display case in museums that arrange like 500 little pieces of stuff. And I think, to me, like for a viewer who like only really recently, like in my life, felt any sense of agency in museums, there just seemed to be more space for me to think within those places. So, and I, reflecting on the Aga Khan Museum show, they invited me to do this work, and I made a special commission for that show. And when I was touring the museum, they were going to give me access to anything. I went into the basement where a lot of the collection was stored, and I was given all of these cohesive pieces. So I held like a 6th century Quran cover, in my trembling hands, or I held like this really, really, priceless artifact. And as an artist, I felt very intimidated, and I sort of froze. And as the conservator sort of moved her sort of what is that called, like compressed sort of storage, and as she moved it along, it landed on these empty these shelves that didn't have artifacts, but just had her bubble wrap and her foam and all of her props. And suddenly I felt like I could make work in that space. And we had a good laugh, because she was like, I'm letting you hold this like precious object, but where the liveness is for me as an artist is in these very interstitial materials.
That's such a great story, and I want to pick up on this idea of holding, actually, and the sort of intimacy that comes with holding. One of our participants has flagged the connection between this work and Rachel Whiteread's work. Rachel Whiteread being the artist in the UK who is well known for casting the inside of a townhouse. So its absences, its negative spaces, its removals, but within the context of cityscape or urban life. And you're working in this mode within the intimacy of the object that you can hold in your hand. And now you've just shared with us the sort of what it felt like to hold the collection object. And I'm wondering if you could speak to that role of intimacy and scale within this context of absences and removals.
Yeah, so thanks for bringing that up, and I think it leads to what I'm working on now, which is really about this relationship of the body in the museum. So I'm very, very curious about cultivating spaces in museums where we can have a prolonged look. And what does that mean when museums actually become spaces where the spaces are choreographed in a way where you can be transformed by an object? That you can sit for a long time with a singular object and actually begin to have a relationship with it, rather than this sort of capitalistic model of just like zipping through and spending 30 seconds, you know, with a
Right, the sort of,
the
kind of like, the
yeah,
scan, yeah.
and I'm hoping, you know, I'm hoping that discussion changes, you know, as less and less people are going to be allowed in a museum at once, that people will actually have time to spend with objects. And I'm curious about that intimate exchange that is going to happen, and also what that's going to do to your soul, what that's going to do to the quality of your life, and how then that brings up real questions about how museums can care for their publics. Maybe museums need to start, you know, using these incredible theaters, rather than being theaters of violence and theaters of looting, to really be theaters that evoke more contemplative practice and more practices of care. So I'm thinking a lot about that, and this work is based on, you know, a lot of examples of South Asian art that is specifically rooted in the tantric tradition, where rather than paintings existing as purely aesthetic objects, they become supports to meditation. So you actually
Right.
sit with a form, you spend time with a form, and then when you are on the bus or when you're at home, you can recall that painting again in your mind and use it as a support to sink back into, you know, into a meditative state, or into a joyful state, or into a space of calm.
I love how you're speaking to the integration of spirituality within your work, which you spoke to at the beginning, and it's phenomenal how much it is part of your entire approach to all of the questions in the work that you've been pursuing. And I think another thing that really stands out to me about what you were just discussing is how you're making a link between the idea of the museum as a site of contemplation and respite, you could say, and care, without being a place of escape, right? And I think one of the challenges in the present is or for quite a while now, in some sense, has been what's the function of the museum, right? What's the kind of contemporary function, and how much is it a sort of location away from? How much is it a respite from kind of all the cacophony of the world and all of the sounds? And is it a time just for kind of quiet, versus how is it, in what ways is it engaged in the sort of the often very troubling day-to-day aspects of life? And I think that in this wonderful way, you've just completely flipped that oppositionality into this kind of interlaced connection, where it is about slowing down and being with the work, but also about care and about self-realization or self-preservation in some way, but not in the sense of removal. Not that it's like, and we've been speaking about removal in a different way, but not in the sense of an escapism. You're not sort of getting away from the world to avoid it by going and looking at like beautiful 19th century paintings or like, you know, medieval artifacts or something like that. But in fact, you're using those or engaging with those objects as an opening to think about all of these questions about why they're there and what's not there in the spaces in between them. So, and it feels to me like that comes out of your spiritual dimension of your engagement with these questions.
These shouldn't be closed conversations, you know. I mean, I think a work should be an entry point to something else. And I mean, artists in history have always been in conversation with each other and with their public. So the fact that, you know, for many people, the museum experience severs these conversations. You know, and again, back to your question about language, like through the objects, but also through didactics, you know, which are sometimes so dumb, you know. That, you know, it almost closes down a conversation rather than inviting a public to really
Right.
to work in that space, you know.
Samir, it's been so much fun speaking with you today and hearing from you and seeing your work and looking at it a little bit more. Really, thank you for being here with us. Folks in Toronto will have an opportunity to see Samir's work coming up before long at the Koffler Gallery, and then a little bit later at the AGYU Art Gallery of York University. So of course, all schedules are kind of changing all the time because of COVID. So stay tuned to find out exactly when those dates are. For the Gardner, we are reopening next week. We're really looking forward to it. So check out our website and our Instagram feed for more info about that. We have a free weekend with our reopening. So maybe come in and think about what are the gaps in the Gardner? Where are the spaces and what can you find in those in between? We do have another 3 Works program scheduled for this time next week, 1 p.m. Thursday, with the artist Azza El Siddiq, a Canadian artist currently based in the US. And Azza has a work in our exhibition Raw, which will be on view when we reopen. So thanks everyone for joining us. Thank you again, Samir. And yeah, everyone be well. Okay. Take care.
Bye.